we refer to the Pacific Crest Trail, the Continental Divide Trail, and the Appalachian Trail. I did that. I decided to go for a little bit of extra bonus because you see some purple on either side of the AT. When they designed the AT, they didn't make it cross the country, so I fixed it. Instead of going Georgia to Maine, I started at Key West and I went up to Nova Scotia. So, as Lubna said, my name is Matthew. I may have a slight problem with moderation that I totally blame this program for, because when I came through in 2008, and this young gentleman over here is Thru, look at me, I was so nice and innocent, didn't even have a beard. That's snow camp our year. And at the time I had done some hiking, but nothing serious. And I went through WTC and just the descent happened. It's like meth, not even once. I started doing mountains, pretty much everything I could get my hands on. Also, during WTC, this gentleman on the right, Mr. Payne, told me about the PCT. And I'm like, oh, that's really cool. I wanted to do that. But how can you take 6 months off, go and hike for like 4 to 6 months, then come back and have a life? That was the part I wasn't able to figure out. Until 2019, where basically I just decided to screw it. I had been in IT for 20 years, yet another IT company was going down underneath me, screwing over some benefits in the process. I also had multiple friends that were sick, had life-altering things happen, and I also had a distressingly supportive girlfriend who encouraged me to just say, screw it, let's go do something different. So we went big. How do you go off and hike for 6 months? We got rid of our apartment. We moved into a van, the one you see parked outside, live out of campgrounds, and then decided this is the year we're going to do the PCT. PCT goes from Mexico to Canada, 2,600 miles. It is our local trail, and the kind of rallying cry along the trail is embrace the suck. Because you were going to have good days, you were going to have bad days, probably more bad days, but you remember the good days, so it kind of, works out. Unfortunately, we were doing it in 2020. You might remember some little event happened there, not that big of a deal. All of a sudden, it's like people that were on the trail were getting off the trail, they weren't letting international people in, there was arguments about whether you could hike, whether you couldn't. So here we are in March, getting booted out of the campground we're living out, not even sure if we're able to do the trail. Fortunately, it worked out. Turned out we're homeless, so we weren't affected by the lockdown, and this was a perfect way to quarantine. So, on May the 4th, we went down to the border. Basically, I was going to start. When Jen got off school, she was going to come join me. And then when she had to go back to work, because somebody needs to make money and have benefits, then I would continue on solo. This is an unusual picture. Normally when people start this, there's like 10 to 20 people down at the border. There was nobody, except like one border guy that came over to see what we were up to. Basically, in 2019, when you look at the numbers of people that say they finished the PCT, there were 1,900 people. The year 2020, 300 of us finished. So it was a way different year, and anybody who's done the trail like in the last 2 years will tell you about all the crowds and other impact they've had. We didn't have any of that. Actually, I took pictures every time I saw more than like one other person because it was so unusual. And I always got to camp alone. I was just out. This is an example of one of the sections of the desert where I was just all alone and I would rarely see somebody. This is the most people I ever saw at once. Again, it was enough of a thing to have a crowd that I took a picture. This is at Kennedy Meadows right before we loaded up into the Sierra Nevada. So, May 5th is actually pretty late. I think it's better because it helps you out in the Sierra, but that means I had heat waves. We're talking like 95 plus degrees for multiple days on end. No big deal, right? All you're doing is walking. Most of the time, if it was under 95 degrees, I would just survive, complain about it to myself, but what are you gonna do? There's nobody to complain to. When it got really hot, I would have to wait out the middle of the day. So I'd crawl into something like this and basically sit there until 4 or 5 in the afternoon, and then I'd have to get my miles in. Because I needed to be doing 15 to 20 miles plus a day. As with a lot of things on the trail, if you've read anything online about it, fear-mongering is massive. This section is called the Aqueduct. I remember them talking about this for 400 or 500 miles on the way up. About, oh, people run out of water, they get heat stroke, things like that. It's 17 miles and it's dead flat. If you run out of water, you've really messed something up on this. And common, like there was a landslide on San Jacinto that was supposedly really dangerous. There's just a lot of that. What you realize is the people that are posting online, writing books, things like that are sometimes not the busiest people. So, they're not actually doing the trail, things like that. The desert is actually one of my favorite sections of this trail. I love the entire thing, obviously. You can hear how excited I am. But you just have like awesome views like this, and especially at the end of the day. was great. It also goes up in the mountains, so you go up around Big Bear, things like that. I had everything from wind to rain, awesome sunsets. That's when it goes over San Jacinto, so people who try and start in March will generally hit snow up here. There's actually been fatalities even for people trying to go too early. And then the really dull part of the desert is around Tehachapi, garden spot of, Southern California, which is where all the wind farms come through. You rent a nice hotel in Tehachapi, nice. All of the walls are covered in pictures of windmills, because that's what they do at. At mile 700, all of a sudden the game changes. 700 miles, yes, that's a lot, but now you're just kind of like settled in, right? And now it's the High Sierra. This is what people are generally looking forward to when they talk about the PCT. I wasn't looking forward to it as much just because I've done a lot in the Sierra, so I knew like around every curve practically what was going on. The interesting thing we did here though is to get out, you basically have to hike over a pass all the way down, hitch in, and reverse that to resupply in the middle. We didn't have time for that. We had places to go, so we just did a 10-day food carry. So it was for about 180 miles. It was the heaviest our packs ever were. I think they were, what, 35 pounds?
Almost 40.
Almost 40 pounds. They were atrocious. That's actually me with the 10-day food carry. It's all about how you pack and what you pack. We were in the Sierra in June 20th, and the advantage to that is if we had been early in the season, this would have been covered in snow. This is why a lot of people end up having to bail out, get hurt, things like that. I do snow climbs, but you don't want to have to try and make distance in the snow. Plus side also, that was late enough where a lot of the meadows and everything were just spectacular. This is back on evolution. Another cool thing that happened along the way is we saw like rock fall off to the left. And then we find out that there'd been like there'd been an earthquake that caused a massive slide that closed Whitney Portal, which we didn't care about. That was right up there with, COVID lockdowns and like riots down in Santa Monica. We're in a different world. All those little dots are mosquitoes, because you do have to go through the mosquito season. After that, you get into Northern California. I was really excited for here, because this is where I was back on New Trail. NorCal is known for kind of humidity, greenness, and the fact that you're up on a ridge, and then you drop like 3,000 or 4,000 feet, resupply down here, get your like 3 or 4 or 5 days of food, and then you get to climb several thousand feet back up to the top and continue on. Lots of fun. Also, there were waterfalls, which is one of Jen's favorite. This is Bernie Falls along the way. The views were okay. You actually go up to Shasta, and you go out, around, and back. So it's like, oh yeah, beautiful Shasta once again. Now, up here we started to have a thing where in order to get into town, the trail doesn't go through town. This is the side of the 5. Jen and I were sitting there trying to flag somebody down. It's okay, we did get somebody. They were slightly drunk and just out of the hospital, but it worked out, we lived. Resupplies are typically something like this. We go into town, we run into the Yield General, charge things while we can, grab a bunch of food, run the heck back out of town, or if we're spoiled, get a hotel for that night. Normally, there is something called trail magic. That's basically where people just show up and bring you food and things. It's usually like ex-hikers, people that want to hike, things like that. We didn't get a lot of that because of the COVID situation. This was rare because this was one of like, I think 3 incidences we had. The Affection Sheep, it was their sign-in, and then they had like, they were making burgers and pizzas and things like that. Bummer about California is, do you know how long California is? I can verify for you. It is 1,600 some miles to get out of California. You are halfway through Mexico to Canada, and you still have 300 miles in California. A lot of people quit at that exact sign because you think about all the bad days you've had so far, and you're like, oh my God, it's only halfway over. But at mile 1,600, you finally get out, and that was about when Jen had to go back to work. It was also about the time when fire season hit big. We weren't hit nearly as bad as people like the last 2 years, but it was a constant stressor as we were going. Basically, after you're out of California, you've got 500 miles of Oregon, 500 miles of Washington. Oregon is really nice. It's relatively flat after all the mountains in NorCal and the Sierra. It also has this. These are the best nachos I have had in 3 through hikes. They were amazing. They're at Timberline. I would do the PCT again just for these nachos. Also, it is easy except for the Mordor section that nobody tells you about when they say that Oregon is easy. For like 60 miles, all of a sudden you are in the middle of lava rocks. They are endless. They go through your feet. That's what my feet turned into. I got 3 hours earlier off that day to rest, and then I had to hike all the next day. But other than that, it's really, really nice. At mile 2100, all of a sudden you're in Washington. This is called Bridge of the Gods. It's kind of like a cool crossing. You can see you barely have to like inch right past the traffic, but they know it's PCT, so they generally don't run you over. Washington is really pretty. You are back in the mountains. This is Goat Rocks, largely considered the prettiest spot along the PCT. I really enjoyed it. I got to go over in just a minor windstorm, but it's okay. I wasn't about to get blown over. And then fire season arrived with a vengeance. This is about 2 hours difference. Basically, California was on fire. Giant smoke cloud went around, dropped right on top of me. That was down the hill when I went into town. So now I'm 250 miles from the end, and I end up having to take 3 days off because it's not safe to go outside. Like literally they're telling you to hold your breath, put your head in a bag, things like that. And I'm like, but I have to walk. Fortunately, after 3 days, it got good enough that that's an N95 before they were trendy. This is 2020, thank you very much. Somebody gave it to me up there. So I went hiking after dark with an N95 in the rain. And after that, it did get better. This is what I refer to as the most scenic toilet on the Pacific Crest Trail. You go over a little hill, you do your business. It's a thunderbox name because when you drop the lid, everybody hears it. Also, since it was now mid-September, it was rainy season in the Sierras, and at the time, this was a big deal to me because I didn't even conceive of the words Key West to Canada and when I would live it in the rain. The last big rainstorm, it was a couple of days, and it actually ended up snowing on us. So when I went over Rainy Pass, I camped right under the snow rain line, and then I went over on fresh snow in the Cascades. Spectacularly beautiful. The trail up there is a little rougher. The PCT is generally fairly gentle and well-maintained, except in the remote parts of the Cascades where you've got things like this, a little bit of overgrowth. But at that point, you're basically home free. Nothing's stopping you short of like breaking something, right? Which is good, because my feet were killing me and I was having horrible rashes trying to carry the pack. So as long as I didn't have to walk or carry a pack, I was good. Except that's, all I was doing. Now, the other problem we had is COVID, right? They shut down the border. Nobody could get in, nobody could get out. Normally, the PCT ends right at the border, 30 miles in a remote area. You go over to Canada, come back. Couldn't do that, so we got a bonus 30 miles. We got to go out, tag the border, come back. But at that point, it's a rounding error, and you get to see everybody that you'd seen on the way. So, after 148 days, I had made it 2,683 miles, no skips. I had done a continuous footpath the entire way. Who was there with me? Jen was at work. This gentleman named Shenanigans, who had stolen a bathrobe out of a hotel and had worn it for the latter half of the trail. He was an interesting person. I had never seen a pothead get so worked up over Star Wars controversies as I did at that. This is what I looked like before and after. I had not cut my hair since quitting my job. So what now? I'd wanted for 10 plus years to do the PCT, and now I'd successfully done it. Well, if you go ask for a raise from your boss and they give it to you like that, what does that tell you? You aim too low, right? So now I'm like, Triple Crown. I got to start working on that. I was never going to do the AT. I didn't like the AT. Too much crowds, green tunnel, stuff like that. But now I want to go do that. So I'm like texting with Jen saying, hey, I'm going to go do the AT. And then I'm like, hey, WTC is going away this year. 21-21, we were on hiatus. So I'm going to go do the Florida Trail, then come back, then do the AT. Then I texted her again and said, actually, I'm going to go down, start 200 miles south of the Florida Trail, do the Florida Trail, hike up to the AT, continue and go up into Canada. And Jen's just like, yeah, okay, of course you are, yes. So 3 months the day later after I finished the PCT, I flew down to Key West. This is the southernmost point there, and I started off what would be a 10-month, 5,000-mile epic. Part 2 of 3 on this talk. Now, if you've been down to the Keys, usually the question people give me is, I've been down to the Keys, I don't remember any sort of trail. Yeah, there's not. You're hiking on the side of Highway 1. Also, there's something called a 7-mile bridge. Don't worry, it's just like 6.3 miles. It's all good. It's also got a barrier right about this high. And as I'm walking along and people are like looking at me as they're driving by going, what are you doing? The wind's trying to like blow me off the edge. So I had the image of like some lady watching me like go off the edge and then me having to swim back. Also, where do you camp? That's the hard part, because if you've ever been to the Keys, hotels are expensive. So generally you do what's called stealth camping, which is you try and find some bushes that aren't occupied. I did run into one bush that was already occupied by a rather aggressive homeless guy, but that's okay, your bush, I go elsewhere. This was actually a really good spot I thought was perfect, only to get into the bush, out of view, to find a sign that said, "Caution, venomous snakes." At which point I'm like, yeah, I think I'm going to find another bush. It was highly stressful trying to find a place to camp. The one that I liked the least is Shark Valley was closed due to COVID. Everything's closed due to COVID in 2021. So I camped behind that sign, figuring it would be fine. Turned out the valley was closed, but the rangers were still there, so I got rousted after dark. But it was okay. 200 miles later, I've now walked through the Keys for 100 miles. I've been through the Everglades. I got warned about the locals in the Everglades, got to meet python hunters, all sorts of fun. And now it is the Florida Trail. Florida Trail is one of my favorite hikes. It's a January to March hike. This is the trail. For 36 miles going through Big Cypress, yes, I get that look a lot when I talk about stuff like this. The trail is underwater. It's fine. Everybody thinks that's horrifying. For the first 30 seconds it is, as you plop into the water, and then you're in the water. It doesn't matter. Your feet are already wet. My river crossing shoes went into a trash can, because why bother? It is blazed, though. I mean, it's maintained the entire way. They go in and paint that thing. It was amazing. Normally, the other question people have is, if you're hiking through this all day, where do you camp? The answer is, in a couple of places, they have little mounds that are just above the water. Like one of them I know is called Oh Thank God Camp, at the end of like a 7-mile segment where you can't even sit on a log because there's no water. Really fun. Like I said, Big Cypress, do this if you're ever in southern Florida. After that, it was back on the various canals and things. It was like Mad Max-ish at this point because they're burning like sugarcane fields all around me. Foot issues yet again, and the rain that I thought was traumatic over in the PCT was nothing compared with the biblical levels of rain I hit in Florida. And it wasn't just rain. This was the first time I had a tornado warning that sent me scrambling to find cover. This was the second time, at which point I was hiding out on the side of a church, which had said I could camp there, but everything flooded out because of a major storm that hit it. So I was locked out back, just waiting to see what was happening in my tent. Water was also a challenge. The coloration is actually not that big of a deal. That's just tannins, the sulfur smell and taste that comes with some of the water due to rotting swamp water. That's a little less good. Also, the Florida Trail is somewhat notorious, as a lot of the non-Big 3 trails are, with road walks. But honestly, they're a nice little break from the swamps. My year it was record weather, because that's how things go with me. We're talking like waist deep in a blackwater swamp. In that section on the Swanee, I actually got beard deep. I was just sad Jen wasn't with me, because that would have made for a great picture, because this is about the top of her head. Other than that, though, Florida is very unique and has some of the most striking wilderness of any of the trails I've done. Here, they basically have this one little bridge that goes across the entire swamp that you walk along. And yes, once you're out of the swamp, you're never out of the swamp. I basically got used to my feet never being dry. I'm having to skip ahead on some of this. This is a major thing if you do the Florida Trail. Everybody will tell you for 100 miles, don't miss the Pepsi machine. I don't know what the big deal is, but it's like the most famous thing out there. Highest point on the Florida Trail, 273 miles above sea level. Yes, it took me about 60 days to make it. No, I did not need supplemental oxygen. It's also on a military base where you have to like schedule going between the bombing runs, so it's really, really fun out there. Also, Florida, as much as I love hiking out there, they're not so good about warning you about things like setting fires. Some friends of mine were hiking along, it got smoky, and then they had a burn line from a set fire go straight over the trail. This is a national scenic trail, and they were just like, oh yeah, we probably should have told you that, huh? Towards the end, this is up at Pensacola, the last day on trail, then you walk along the white sand beach. And now, okay, I've done the Florida Trail, and now I need to get up to green, which is the AT. I'm going to take the Pinhoti, which is blue, so how do I get across Alabama? Well, one way to get across Alabama, it's the Alabama Road Walk. For 200 miles, you are literally walking through rural roads. There are people who know what you're doing, though. Some of them are very friendly. I had a lady roll up and say, here, take my extra gun. There's some aggressive dogs up ahead. You might need it. Alabama, right? There is stealth camping, so it was more of the same. Then up at the Pinhoti, which if you remember a guy that set the age record on the AT last year, this is where he started. It's supposedly the start of the Appalachians. This, if you're looking to do a through hike, don't have time to do like a full 2,000 miles. It's about 300 miles, and it's like a mini AT. It's basically the AT without crowds. It's got shelters, goes across 2 states, some minor road walks, things like that. So okay, now I've rolled another 300 miles. Now I'm 1,900 miles into this thing, and I'm finally on the AT. All of a sudden, I'm jumping on the AT, running past people who are just starting out, and they're like, oh, where did you come from? And I'm like, Florida! I became somewhat notorious on the AT while I was out there. If you've heard that the AT is green tunnel, let me tell you, yes, it is. It's great. You save lots of money on sunscreen. Didn't have to wear sunglasses, didn't have to wear sunscreen for lots of it. It also has shelters. If this is your idea of a great wilderness experience, have at it, stay at the shelter. I did not. I do not like being stacked in like hot dogs. Hostels, same thing. Imagine the smell to this, more like a teenage boy's locker room, and you kind of got the idea. There are generally crowds. If you avoid the shelters and avoid the hostels, though, you get away from the worst of it. There was a lot of rain. This was us going into Harper's Ferry, where we just got smacked so hard by rain, all we could do was laugh and keep running forward. And there is also lightning out there. Now in the trees, it's less of a worry. Here, Jen was recording me from behind for a YouTube thing and managed to catch the lightning bolt over there. But look at that red arrow. There was actually a down strike that was close enough to make me quite uncomfortable. Saw that after when I edited it, and I'm like, oh, wow. White Mountain is out there, which is somewhat notorious for having the worst weather in the world. It just hit national news again because it had the coldest weather ever. And basically, the only way you can deal with the massive humidity is wear less clothes, because nothing ever dries out unless you go into a hotel and run the air conditioner. Yes, there are also ticks. The ticks that cause Lyme disease are that small. I caught one on me, and I spent the rest of the time gouging out every mole and little scab that I had. There are also slugs, which sit on all of your gear. The trail is much rougher than the PCT. The PCT is generally graded for horses, so yes, it's long, but it's generally pretty easy. The AT does stuff like this to you. This is on the blazed trail. They didn't go around that. They just blazed it, put rebar into the rock to go up like 20 feet and said, yeah, you're good. And they put stairs sometimes, which is nice, but somebody always removes like the bottom step. So you've always got like a 4-foot step down with the pack in wet conditions you got to get past. So yeah, that's common. I have bad knees, so I don't know how I survived it. But you get through. Good news is you are generally pretty accessible to town, so there is a thing where people say nothing ever goes wrong on the AT because you can always get into town. In fact, if you can hike 25 miles a day, somebody made it through the entire AT without ever camping. That's how accessible the entire thing is. This is Jen's favorite slide because she likes waterfalls, and yes, all of the water meant there were a lot of waterfalls. And in general, when you came out of the green tunnel, it was really pretty. This is McAfee Knob. Katahdin is where the AT ends. It basically, for 5 miles, goes like that, straight up. You look at the elevation line, you think something's wrong. I was up there, basically Labor Day weekend. Everybody is like so tired, done, they just want to go home. And I'm like, see you guys, I'm going to Canada. Hopped over the edge, went over the knife edge, jumped on something called the International AT. Basically, the mountain range used to be all together on the Pangea days. It's split apart. Europe got some of it, America got some of it, Canada got some of it. They kind of share custody. So I was continuing on that. At this point, it's less trail, more roads and ATV trails, but I got to see a lot more animals. Saw 2 moose and a bear the day after I went over Katahdin. There were shelters on the main section, and they were mostly empty. Another cool thing is you get to hike like right across the border stripe. Literally, you're calling Border Patrol and saying, hey, I'm going to be walking along there, and you're walking along going, this is Canada, this is the US. And there was a waist-deep beaver bog just for me, because, weather. September 15th, Canada had reopened, fortunately. I was able to cross over. Canada, there was also no legal camping, but it's okay because Canadians, they don't generally come after you with weaponries or dogs or anything. Unfortunately, Quebec is a pain in the ass to deal with, and they closed down due to moose hunting and caribou season. So instead, some literal Mounties gave me a ride, and I continued over at Prince Edward Island. I titled that episode, I think, Masochist of Green Gables. At that point, I was somewhat famous because not a lot of people come to Nova Scotia or PEI, so people were driving an hour or two to give me wine and pizza, which was really awesome. They'd pop out of the car and go, bonjour, senor masochist. At which point I get to the end of PEI, jump over to Nova Scotia, hiking across the lovely Nova Scotia. There it's basically a rail trail, so again, really, really nice hiking. There's some ferries to get across. The colors started to change right when I was near the end. And then finally, I've done 4,900 miles and I'm at Sydney. What to do? I could end there, but does that look like a cool terminus? No. I went 100 miles to the very northern tip of Nova Scotia because Newfoundland was winter conditions already. I couldn't do that. Because, 100 miles is like a rounding error at that point, right? I went up to the eloquently named Meat Cove. Yeah, it was depressing, just ugly, not pretty at all. Arrived at Meat Cove, did the only logical thing, hiked back to Meat Cove, literally to the point where there is a point, there is ocean, and you can't go any further. Set up camp here was kind of sad, but it's okay, because at 2 o'clock in the morning, windstorm comes up, damn near blows me off into the ocean. At that point, I'm now one of like maybe 40 people that's done the ECT, but nobody just does 2 of the 3 big trails. Now it's time for the CDT, which we're going to do really, really quick. CDT is somewhat known as the hard one. The AT is everybody's first through hike. PCT is generally known as the party, and then the AT is barbarians screaming at the wilderness. While it is 3,100 miles, most people do not do 3,100 miles along the CDT. A lot of the routes have shortcuts. I know this because I was redlining, and all of a sudden everybody would disappear until we came back around to the other side of the shortcut and we'd see everybody again. We left on June 5th. We went to Glacier. This is not a Photoshop. It is just depressing like that. It was also early season, so we got to do snow slopes. They hadn't set up the bridges yet, so Jen got to do American Gladiator going across as some tourists looked on in horror. We also had grizzly bears. There was much longer food carries. Our average food carry was probably 5 to 6 days. Going through the Bob, we were 18 days between towns, which is a long time between showers. Also, the trail is not maintained quite as well. This is the Bob Marshall. The joke was the Bob stands for blowdown over blowdown, and all day we were climbing over just like stacks of logs. There were more cows than I expected, so many more cows, plus side cows generally need water to survive, so did we, so we just like shooed the cows away. Downside, everything smelled like cow poop. There was also a lot of bad weather. About 15 minutes before this, I was just getting pounded up on a ridge, wondering if I was going to get hit by lightning. Here I was actually after dark, it was raining, and the rain clouds are being lit up by the lightning in the clouds. Yellowstone, I love this. It was this backcountry area of Yellowstone where you're literally like a foot or 2 away from the geysers. You go through the winds, then you're going through the desert where you have 30-mile water carries. That pretty much captures the basin about as good as you can imagine. Then all of a sudden you're in Colorado. Colorado is what puts the brutality in the CDT. It was all good until I ended up coming down with COVID. So I did the only logical thing, went into town for 2-3 days. Too expensive, went back out, tried to quarantine at 12K. That didn't work, had to go back into town. 10 days later, I decided I'm still not done, and I was back on the trail. Couldn't breathe fully, but I was managing. Now we're in the late season. There is snow and other things going on. And then October 11th, has anybody here had norovirus? Stuff shooting out both ends. That was a very bad night. I basically came off, went back on trail. I could only make 6 miles a day now. This is areas with 15-mile water carries. So that was basically the point where I had to come off the trail. So this next summer, if you're interested in any of this, we do have a YouTube channel. Our YouTube channel is called First Church of Damascus. We're also on Instagram. This summer, our thing is doing the Arizona Trail. That's immediately after class 10, but why just do the Arizona Trail? So instead I'm going to hike across Utah too, because that's the sort of thing you do as a rounding error now. Then I'm going to meet her, and we're going to paddle the Mississippi from source down to the ocean, because that's the thing we do. And then I'm going to go back and finish that part of the CDT. Because that clears my next summer to, I've just been negotiating with these people to try and do an east to west on the American Discovery Trail. And you wouldn't believe all the other stuff I have lined up. So if you're interested, we post online. If you're interested in doing any of the trails, I'm always happy to talk endlessly. Pretty much any through hiker loves talking about the trail. And it is highly recommended to quit your job, abandon spouses, pets, etc., and go through hike. Okay. I know.
Well, I can't match his energy.